The Supernatural Power of Your Mind. Author: unknown. The awakening of consciousness is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new creation. One where you are the alchemist of your own reality and the artisan of a limitless mind. In this text, flowing from the hands of an unknown author, we immerse ourselves in a profound exploration of spiritual growth and inner mastery. With no name to claim it, the book stands as a timeless guide for those seeking something beyond the physical, a manual for quantum transformation that opens the doors to a deeper understanding of life and the universe. This book isn't just a compendium of spiritual ideas. It's a journey into the heart of human power to create, manifest, and transform reality. Throughout its pages, you'll find teachings on vibration, inner coherence, and how the power of the mind serves as a tool to navigate the quantum ocean. Here, each chapter is a door to a greater understanding of what it means to live in full consciousness and how to apply it in daily life, and how to activate our potential to create a life in harmony with universal laws. Chapter 1. The First Call of Mystery. In a corner of the world, where the shadows of the everyday tend to blend with the fleeting glimmers of the extraordinary, lived John, a man whose name carried no distinction, nor stood as a banner of great deeds. Nevertheless, in his chest, a subtle disquiet germinated silently, like the roots of a tree sinking deep into unexplored lands. John hadn't always felt that silent call that now persistently haunted him. He had been an ordinary man, one of those who don't question the threads of destiny woven for them, believing that life is governed by unmovable laws, that everything that is, always was and always will be. But in the solitary nights, when the breath of darkness seemed to envelop every corner of his humble dwelling, something invisible began to stir in the air. John perceived it not as a voice, but as a distant echo, a resonance that vibrated in the deepest fibers of his being. It was on one of those nights that everything changed. The wind blew with a strange cadence, as if the very air conspired with hidden forces. The windows, usually quiet in his room, trembled slightly, and John, who had slept with the weight of exhaustion on his eyelids, sat up from his bed, overcome by a sensation that wasn't entirely his own. In the quiet that followed, the house seemed to be watching him. The furniture, the walls, the old photographs seemed charged with an unknown intention, as if they were mute witnesses to a truth yet to be revealed. Without knowing exactly why, John went outside. The night sky stretched above him like a vast ocean of shadows and stars. The tall, ancient trees, like eternal witnesses of centuries, whispered their secrets in the wind. John took a deep breath and, for the first time in a long time, felt that the air entering his lungs was not the same that usually filled his body during the daytime hours. It was laden with something different, something that seemed to stir his most deeply rooted thoughts, as if the universe were whispering an ancient, forgotten knowledge into his ear. Suddenly, time seemed to stop. The howling of wolves in the distance faded, the whisper of the wind ceased, and John found himself in the midst of absolute silence. In that unexpected void, something else manifested, not in words, but in the very essence of being. It was as if the world itself had paused to behold him, as if a force beyond understanding had chosen him, calling him to something he couldn't comprehend, but which inevitably drew him in. It wasn't fear he felt, but a palpable certainty that his life was about to be torn from the edges of the known and launched into the unfathomable. The days that followed were of a strange intensity. Although the hours passed with the usual monotony of work and responsibilities, he felt a constant agitation within him. His mind wrestled between following the dictates of reason and surrendering to the chaos of the uncertain, but his heart, that organ that seemed to beat with a new cadence, knew that the rational had no place in what was to come. Routine itself seemed to crack under the weight of something invisible but undeniable, as if reality were being undermined from within, revealing truths that had always been there, but that John had never been able to perceive. That fateful night was not the end, but the beginning of something John hadn't asked for, but which was now inescapable. In the days that followed, he began to notice details that had previously escaped him: the whimsical dance of shadows in the corners of his home, the way the dawn lights seemed to take on a different, almost golden hue, as if they were imbued with an energy alien to the sun. As the days progressed, the feeling that something or someone was guiding him grew stronger. It was as if a constant presence moved around him, observing him from the limits of his perception, whispering in a language spoken not with words, but with emotions, with vibrations that only his soul could decipher. One event in particular was etched in his memory. He was walking along a path he knew well, bordered by tall trees that whispered to each other in the soft evening breeze. Suddenly, something in the air changed, as if the very atmosphere had taken a new breath. John stopped, feeling an almost tangible weight in the air, and then he saw it. It was nothing more than a flicker, a ray of light piercing through the foliage of the trees, but in that brief instant, time seemed to stop again. In that blink of light, John felt as if his own being were unfolding, as if there was something beyond himself, something vast and unknown that surrounded him and gazed upon him with infinite patience. That light, that ephemeral but eternal moment, pierced his heart like a seed of mystery. John knew, without any need for explanation, that his life had changed forever. The questions he had once avoided, about the purpose of existence, about destiny, about what lies beyond the visible, now surged with an impossible urgency. And although he had no answers, not even a map to guide him, John knew deep in his being that his path would lead him to places where reason had no place, where the unknown reigned and the supernatural was nothing more than nature in its purest form. The call of mystery had been made, and John, though fearful, was ready to answer. Chapter 2. The Threshold of Change. Dawn rose with the pale light of a sun that seemed to hesitate before emerging. John's days grew increasingly unusual, as if the very core of time and space were dissolving into silent alterations. He walked through his life with a constant sense of strangeness, a feeling that enveloped him like a dense, persistent mist. There was something in the folds of reality that watched him from the darkest corners, from the most forgotten moments. Events that once seemed mere coincidences now intertwined with unsettling precision. Hours passed like fleeting shadows, and every encounter, every spoken or thought word, resonated with a deep echo in John's soul. He knew he was on the brink of something unknown, something that could not be named or comprehended by the mundane mind. As the invisible pressure on his being grew, John found himself increasingly close to an invisible threshold, a line that divided life as he knew it from a vast and enigmatic territory, one that his human senses could barely glimpse. It was in the stillness of the night that the signs became clearer. The world, in its superficiality, continued its routines of noise and movement, but beneath that trivial layer there was another rhythm, an older, more serene one that pulsed in unison with forgotten forces. John, sitting in the silence of his room, felt that pulse deep within his being. It was not a sound or a vision, but a vibration that moved through his bones, his flesh, and his mind, as if it were part of something much larger than himself, as if his seemingly small life were intertwined with the very threads that moved the stars and tides. John had been drawn to the edge of an unnamed abyss, a summit where the known and the unknown intertwined in a fabric of mysteries that cried out to be deciphered. In that dark, silent depth, he felt something looming over him, something that called him, urged him to cross a threshold that not everyone saw, but which, once crossed, would transform him in unimaginable ways. The change did not arrive as an abrupt blow, but as a slow erosion of his certainties. The first cracks appeared in the most ordinary days. He felt in the very air around him the promise of an inevitable transformation, though its form and purpose remained hidden in the shadows. Nevertheless, John perceived that something within him, something deep and primordial, was beginning to crumble. The walls of his old life, built on the foundations of logic and reason, creaked under the pressure of what wished to emerge. One morning, as he gazed at the cloudy sky from his window, a sudden wave of emotion shook him. It was neither sadness nor joy. It was an amalgam of emotions, a kind of nostalgia for something he had never known, yet which had somehow always been present within him. In that instant, John knew he could no longer walk the path of his life without paying attention to what his soul whispered to him. The signs he had once ignored with the indifference of one who does not understand now besieged him with an impossible urgency. John remembered all the times in his life when he had fled from the present, seeking refuge in memories of the past or in illusions of the future. He remembered how his mind, always restless, had jumped from one thought to another, searching for answers in places where they were not to be found. But now he understood that everything he had been seeking, everything he had ever desired, existed nowhere else but in this moment. It was as if life itself had extended an invisible hand to him, inviting him to stay still, to immerse himself in the eternity of the present. And it was in that instant, in that profound connection with the now, that John felt his being begin to expand. Not physically, but spiritually. He felt his consciousness extend beyond the limits of his body, beyond the confines of his mind. He became part of the landscape around him, part of the sky and the air. There was no longer any separation between him and the world. John was not simply a man. He was a fragment of the whole, a spark of the infinite consciousness that permeated everything that existed. The present, in its unfathomable vastness, embraced him, and as he remained there, in that silent union with existence, he understood that he needed nothing more. He did not need to know what was coming, nor to cling to what had happened. All that mattered was this moment, this beat of the universe that resonated within him. And then, with that understanding that transcended words, John closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Every inhalation connected him more deeply with the infinite present. Every exhalation released the last vestiges of his old self. It was as if he were being reborn, not as a new person, but as a purer version of himself, stripped of the layers of fear, doubt, and desire that had held him captive for so long. The infinite present was not a place to arrive at. It was a state of being. It was a total surrender to what is, without struggle or resistance. John understood it in the deepest part of his being. There was nothing to seek because everything was already here. There was nothing to achieve because everything he would ever need he already possessed in this very instant. And in that knowledge, he found a peace that filled him completely, a peace that no external event could disturb. He remained there, in silence, allowing the stillness of the present to completely envelop him. There were no more questions, no more doubts. There was only the now, the constant and silent beat of the universe that held him in its infinite embrace. John had found the infinite present, and in it he had found eternity. Chapter 4. Inner Renewal. Activating the Power Centers. There was a distinct silence in the air that morning, as if nature itself had paused to contemplate something invisible to ordinary eyes. John, upon waking, felt a faint vibration running through his body, like an underground river just beginning to surface. There was something within him that had changed, something slowly unfolding, like a bud beginning to open, revealing its deepest secrets. Although he didn't fully understand what was happening, he could feel it. A subtle but powerful renewal was taking shape within him. For days, he had experienced a strange sensation in the center of his chest, like a fire burning softly without consuming him, yet permeating every fiber of his being. He often paused in the middle of his daily tasks, feeling that something deeper than his thoughts was beginning to awaken. It wasn't simply an emotion or a mere fleeting thought. It was a latent power, an ancient knowledge stirring deep within his being, waiting to be discovered. He had heard of power centers before, but had never given them much importance. Words like chakras or energy centers had seemed, in his old life, distant ideas reserved for those who followed mystical and esoteric paths. However, He now found himself immersed in that reality, a reality he understood not through reason, but through the deep and visceral feeling of his own body. It was as if the entire universe was tracing an energetic map within him, guiding him towards an activation he could no longer stop. One morning, sitting in silence under an ancient tree whose twisted trunk seemed to narrate centuries-old stories, John closed his eyes. His breath became slow, deep, and soon he was aware of a subtle energy moving from the base of his spine, ascending with an unfamiliar gentleness. The sensation was strange, almost unsettling, but not painful. He felt as if something was unlocking in his energy centers. These were not merely points on a map, as he had once believed. They were vortices of power, stations in an internal network that connected his physical being to something much vaster and sacred. With each inhalation, he felt these centers respond, vibrating in unison with a melody that did not belong to this world, but to something beyond the tangible. First, the center at the base of his spine, what the ancients called the root, began to pulse with an intensity that connected him to the earth itself. It was as if every grain of earth beneath his feet merged with his body, granting him a stability and strength he had never known. John felt the old insecurities, the fears that had plagued his mind, slowly fade away like shadows dissipating under the sun's light. He was no longer fragmented. Every part of him began to integrate, unifying into a coherent whole. Higher up, in the abdomen, a second center awakened with a warm, enveloping energy, like the gentle currents of a river caressing its banks. This center not only connected him to his deepest emotions, but also to his creativity, to the power to manifest and create. John felt old passions, those he had left behind in his youth, begin to rekindle, not as mere memories, but as living flames seeking to express themselves in the physical world. The creative force he had once considered lost now unfolded within him, powerful and renewed. Upon reaching the center of his chest, John was enveloped in a sensation of expansion so vast that for a moment he felt there were no longer any limits between his being and the universe around him. This center, the heart, was the bridge between the earthly and the divine, and in it, John found a peace that transcended all human understanding. It was not the peace of stillness, but the vibrant peace of love in its purest form, an energy that did not ask or demand, but simply radiated, illuminating every corner of his soul. All the pain, the wounds, and the scars of the past vanished in that light, dissolving into a love so profound that not even the shadows of fear could resist it. As the energy ascended, it reached the center of his throat, where he felt a knot that for years had imprisoned his voice, his unspoken truths, his unexpressed desires. But now that knot gently unraveled, and a new clarity emerged in his mind. It was as if he could speak not only with words, but with the force of the Spirit flowing freely through him. John understood that truth, his truth, could no longer be contained. The power of his voice, now unleashed, resonated with a pure vibration, as if every word he uttered from that moment onward carried the weight of his inner transformation. The ascent continued towards the third eye, the center located between his eyebrows. John felt a gentle but constant pressure in that area, as if an invisible door was slowly opening, allowing him to glimpse realities that were once just shadows in his consciousness. This center did not grant him simple visions or dreams. It gave him the ability to see beyond appearances, to perceive the subtle connections between all things. The veils of illusion that had once obscured his mind were lifting, and in their place appeared a new clarity, a deep intuition that allowed him to navigate the world with renewed confidence. Finally, the energy ascended to the crown of his head, where John felt as if a golden light began to pour over him from above. This center, the last to awaken, was not just a point of connection with the cosmos. It was the portal to divinity itself. John felt as if he were floating in the ether, his body and mind united in a state of grace. There was no separation between him and the divine. There was no distinction between what was human and what was celestial. All was one, all was totality, and in that instant, John knew that true renewal was not simply a matter of body and mind, but of spirit. The activation of his power centers was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a new life, a life in which every step he took would be aligned with the cosmic energy flowing through him. He was no longer the man he had been. Now he was a living manifestation of that ancient force that had always been latent within him, patiently waiting to be awakened. Thus, seated under the tree, John opened his eyes. The world around him was still the same, but he was no longer. Chapter 5. Reconfiguring Mind and Body. The wind blew with a strange sweetness, as if carrying the memories of distant times in its arms. John, now a man reborn in the essence of what is, felt life in a way he had never experienced before. It wasn't just the stillness of nature or the slow rhythm of his own steps that made him feel different. It was as if something much deeper was brewing within him, something that transcended the superficial understanding of mind and body. It was a reconfiguration, a rewriting of the invisible framework that connected both worlds. John had learned that mind and body were not separate entities, but two manifestations of the same force, two reflections of a unique energy flowing through all things. This revelation did not come to him as a sudden flash, but as a truth that had always been latent, patiently awaiting the moment to be discovered. And now, in the midst of his own awakening, that truth unfolded before him with the force of a river breaking through the old floodgates of ignorance. Sitting under a sky that seemed wider than the horizon itself, John allowed himself to enter a state of deep meditation. His breath, slow and rhythmic, was the echo of something much older than his own life, as if with each inhalation and exhalation he was synchronizing his being with the very heartbeat of the universe. As his consciousness expanded, he felt his mind and body intertwine, as if they were two threads of the same fabric weaving into a perfect symphony. He began to perceive the old tensions and patterns that had governed his life until that moment. They were not mere physical pains or discomforts. They were the echoes of thoughts and emotions that had become trapped in his body, forming invisible knots that limited his movement, both physical and spiritual. But now, with each breath, John felt these knots slowly unravel, as the old bonds dissolved into the vastness of the present. The mind, once confined to the narrow limits of logic and reason, began to expand beyond the known, exploring territories he had never before imagined. It was no longer a rigid and controlling tool. It had become a field of infinite possibilities, a fertile garden where new ideas and visions grew with the freedom of a tree extending its branches towards the sun. John felt the old beliefs and conditionings crumble, giving way to a freer, more fluid mind, capable of adapting and transforming without the resistance that had once dominated his being. His body, on the other hand, responded with the same fluidity. The movements that had once been marked by the rigidity of habit now became light, as if every fiber of his being were in harmony with the natural flow of life. John could feel the energies that had once been blocked begin to flow freely through his body, as if the ancient channels through which these vital forces ran had been cleansed and purified. It was not just a physical sensation. It was a sensation of complete alignment between body, mind, and spirit. In that state of deep connection, John began to understand something even more profound. He was not only reconfiguring his mind and body, he was reconfiguring his relationship with reality itself. The boundaries between his being and the outer world began to blur. He no longer saw the world as something separate from himself, but as an extension of his own consciousness. Every tree, every river, every star in the sky was a reflection of the energy flowing within him. And as his body and mind reconfigured, so did the universe around him. It was not a transformation that could be seen with the eyes of the outer world, but an inner metamorphosis, a rebirth occurring in the deepest corners of his being. Every cell in his body seemed to be participating in this process, reprogramming, adapting to the new reality John was creating from the center of his consciousness. His thoughts were no longer the masters of his destiny. They were tools he used with intention and clarity, guided by the wisdom flowing from his heart. It was a continuous rebirth. With every breath, with every heartbeat, John felt the old structures that had once defined his existence crumble, like sandcastles before the tide of a higher consciousness. There was no room for fear or doubt. There was only space for the present, for the constant expansion of his being. In that space, in that state of constant reconfiguration, John realized that his life was no longer dictated by the parameters of the past. He was creating something new, something that emerged from the deepest part of his being and extended into the infinite. And so, in the midst of that transformation process, John discovered a truth that resonated in his heart like an ancient melody. Body and mind were merely vehicles for the spirit, tools through which the soul could express itself in the material world. And by reconfiguring his mind and body, he was reconfiguring the expression of his soul on this plane of existence. But reconfiguration was not a passive act. It was a dance between will and surrender, between conscious control and surrender to the higher forces guiding his life. John learned to listen to the whispers of his own body, to pay attention to the subtle signals his mind sent, and in that process, he discovered that true transformation was not something to be forced, but something to be allowed. It was like the growth of a plant. It cannot be rushed, but if properly nurtured, it flourishes in its own time. Days passed and John delved deeper and deeper into this reconfiguration process. His outer life began to reflect the inner changes. People who once seemed distant now felt connected to him in a new way. Situations that once caused him anxiety now resolved with ease and grace. His body, in perfect sync with his mind, responded to every challenge with a calmness and strength he had not known before. The reconfiguration of mind and body was a constant rebirth, a never-ending renewal. John realized that there was no final destination, no endpoint. The process of transformation was in itself the path, and that path was eternal. Every day, every moment was an opportunity to reconfigure, to be reborn, to align more deeply with the truth of his being. And so, as he continued his journey, John understood that there was no separation between him and the universe. What he reconfigured within himself manifested in the outer world. What healed in his body and mind also healed in the fabric of the cosmos. He was creating a new reality, not only for himself, but for all that existed. And in that process, he was fulfilling the deepest purpose of his soul, to be a channel for light, a divine spark illuminating the path to the unknown, to the infinite. John's journey was far from over, but now, with every step he took, he did so from a place of profound peace, knowing that he was reconfiguring his being in harmony with the vast tapestry of existence, and in that reconfiguration, he found freedom, fulfillment, and the true power of simply being who he was destined to be. Chapter 6. The Dark Night of the Soul. The stars that once shone with serene clarity now seemed distant, enveloped in a veil of shadows that covered the firmament. John found himself in a deep solitude, one that could not be measured by the absence of physical company, but by an abyss that had opened within him. It was as if all the lights that had once guided him on his path had suddenly extinguished, leaving him alone before a darkness that extended beyond the limits of his comprehension. He had heard of the dark night of the soul, a term many used to describe that inevitable stage of the spiritual journey where old inner structures began to crumble. But nothing could have prepared him for the magnitude of the void that now surrounded him. Everything he had built, everything he had believed to understand, had vanished like sand swept away by the wind, leaving him in a state of spiritual nakedness that made him feel as fragile as leaves falling in autumn. The outside world continued its course, indifferent to his inner torment. Days slipped by one after another, but for John, time had lost all meaning. Each sunrise brought with it a growing sense of hopelessness, as if the sun itself were unable to pierce the thick fog that enveloped his soul. There were moments when the weight of the darkness seemed insurmountable, and in those moments, John wondered if he would ever see the light again. It was a darkness that not only resided in his mind, but also in his body. He felt that his energy, which had once flowed with strength and vitality, was now stagnant, trapped in the depths of his being. Every movement, every thought felt like a struggle against an invisible force dragging him down, into an abyss from which he was unsure if he would ever emerge. In that darkness, old wounds, those he had believed healed, began to resurface with unexpected ferocity. Memories he had once buried under layers of denial now emerged with piercing clarity. Moments of pain, loss, betrayal. Everything unfolded before him like a somber tapestry he could not avoid contemplating. He could not escape those images. He could not flee the emotions that accompanied them. And in that inability to escape, John understood that he was being confronted with the darkest aspects of his soul, those he had avoided for so long. The silence was deafening. At night, when he was alone in his room, the darkness seemed to acquire a tangible presence, enveloping him in a chilling embrace. Every shadow on the wall seemed to have eyes. Every sound in the distance resonated with an unsettling echo. And in the midst of that darkness, John realized something. He was facing himself. Not the version of himself he showed to the world, not even the version he had come to know in his spiritual awakening, but the most hidden and forgotten part of his being, the part that had been in the shadows from the beginning. The dark night of the soul was not a simple test. It was not an obstacle to overcome. It was a dissolution. Everything he had known, everything he had been, was disintegrating before his very eyes. And yet, in the midst of that dissolution, there was something deeply sacred. Although his mind rebelled, although his body cried out for relief, deep within his heart there was a spark that could not be extinguished. That spark, small and imperceptible, was the only thing that reminded him that even though all seemed lost, there was still something that sustained his existence. Days turned into weeks, and weeks seemed to merge into an endless parade of endless nights. John, trapped in the cycle of his own darkness, began to lose all sense of who he was. The certainties he had once held completely vanished. It was as if he was being stripped of everything, reduced to the bare essentials, to a nothingness that deprived him of identity, purpose, meaning. But in that nothingness, something unexpected began to emerge. It was a particularly dark night, when the wind howled fiercely through the windows, that John felt a change. It was not an external change. It was not the result of a sudden revelation or a miraculous intervention. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but it was there, deep within his being. Something had ignited. It was not the light he had so longed for. It was not the feeling of clarity he expected. It was something much fainter, but much more real: acceptance. John understood in that instant that the dark night of the soul was not a punishment or a test of his spiritual worth. It was a necessary part of his journey, a descent into the darkest depths of his being to be able to emerge with a new consciousness. And in that acceptance, something began to change within him. It was not immediate, it was not dramatic, but it was real. The weight he had felt in his chest for so long began to lighten, and for the first time in weeks he could breathe without feeling that the air was dense as lead. That night, as the wind continued to howl outside, John realized that the darkness he had feared was not external to him. It was a part of his own soul, a part that had been denied, suppressed, and buried. And now, by facing it, by accepting its existence, he could begin the process of integrating it. Darkness was not something to be conquered, but something to be understood, something to be illuminated from within. In the days that followed, John began to experience glimpses of light amidst his darkness. They were not grand revelations or moments of ecstasy, but they were enough to remind him that although the night was deep, there was always the promise of dawn. The spark in his heart, that small light that had sustained him during his descent, began to grow slowly but steadily, illuminating the darkest corners of his soul. And so, John understood that the dark night of the soul was not the end of his journey, but an integral part of it. It was a process of death and rebirth, a purification that prepared him for a deeper level of consciousness, a state of being more aligned with the truth of his existence. And although the path was arduous, although the darkness was still present, he now walked with the certainty that the light was always there, even when it seemed farthest away. John emerged from the dark night of the soul not as the same man he had been before. He was a transformed man, purified by the fire of confrontation with his own being. And although darkness would always be a part of him, he now knew not to fear it. He knew that in the darkest depths of his soul he had found the brightest light. And with that light he would continue his journey, knowing that although the path was uncertain, he was always guided by something much vaster, much deeper than any darkness he might face. Chapter 7. The Wise Heart. Accessing Inner Coherence. The wind blew soft and steady, carrying the scent of damp earth, of fallen leaves decaying in nature's fertile embrace. John, who had traversed the storm of his soul and confronted the shadows that haunted him from within, now found himself in a state of profound calm, as if the entire universe had exhaled along with him. But this peace was not simply the absence of conflict. It was the result of a deeper understanding, of an alignment that did not come from the mind, but from something much deeper and older, the heart. That organ which had always pulsed in his chest now revealed its true nature. It was no longer just a machine pumping blood, nor a romantic symbol of fleeting emotions. In the silence that followed the dark night of the soul, John began to feel the hidden power in his own heart, an energy that belonged neither to the mind nor the body, but to something beyond, something that had remained latent, waiting to be discovered. For days, John had felt a gentle warmth in the center of his chest, a vibration that could not be ignored. At first he had taken it as a passing sensation, a mere echo of his meditations and spiritual practices. But as time passed, that sensation grew more intense, more present, like a drum resounding from the depths of his being, marking a rhythm different from the beats of his physical heart. It was a different kind of beat, a beat that connected his being to an invisible force, a pulse that enveloped him and connected him to something vaster than himself. John began to listen, not with his ears, but with his heart itself. He would close his eyes and, in the stillness of dawn or the calm of night, he would attune himself to that inner vibration. He discovered that this beat, this pulse emerging from deep within his chest, was a kind of language, a silent wisdom that needed no words to be understood. It was the language of inner coherence, of alignment between his soul, his mind, and his body. Sitting by the bank of a river, listening to the murmur of the flowing water, John began to consciously practice inner coherence. It wasn't a complicated process, nor did it require Herculean efforts. It was, in essence, about surrendering to that heartbeat, allowing the rhythm of his heart to guide his thoughts, emotions, and actions. When he did so, he felt everything in his being align with perfect precision, as if the scattered parts of his life, which once seemed so disconnected, now fit together in a larger puzzle, revealing a picture he had never before been able to see. The heart, John understood, was not just the center of his body, it was the center of his being. From there emanated an intelligence that was not rational, but infinitely wise. Each time he connected with that wisdom, he felt his thoughts quieten, as the emotions that had once pulled him in all directions now calmed, like the waves of a calm sea after a storm. In that state of coherence, John realized that his heart knew what his mind could not comprehend. It knew what his body needed. It knew the way forward, even if his mind didn't have all the answers. That inner coherence was not just a state of peace, it was an active force. John discovered that by staying in tune with his heart, his actions in the outer world also transformed. He no longer made decisions out of fear or doubt, but from a place of inner certainty. It wasn't an arrogant certainty, of the kind that comes from ego. It was a soft, humble certainty, but firm, like a mountain. Every step he took in that coherence was a step that brought him closer to his purpose, to the full manifestation of his being in the world. There was a sweetness in that coherence, a feeling of being deeply connected not only to himself, but to everything around him. People who had once seemed indifferent now seemed to shine with a different light. Places that had once seemed monotonous now vibrated with a new energy. John could feel the pulse of the world in his own heart, and that connection filled him with such profound gratitude that sometimes he couldn't hold back tears. But inner coherence was not just a state of ecstasy, it was also a constant challenge. There were days when old shadows tried to return, when the mind, accustomed to its dominance, tried to regain control. In those moments, John realized that the path to coherence was not linear. It was a continuous process, a daily practice of surrender and listening. There were days when the noise of the outside world was so loud that he found it hard to hear the beat of his heart. But even in those moments, he knew that coherence was there, patiently waiting for him to return to it. Over time, John learned to trust his heart absolutely. No matter what the world told him, no matter the external opinions, judgments, or expectations. He knew deep within his being that his heart would always show him the right way. And although that way was not always the easiest or the most comprehensible, he knew it was the only way that would lead him to where he truly needed to be. The wisdom of the heart, John understood, was not a wisdom that could be explained or rationalized. It was a wisdom that could only be experienced. It was like the course of a river that flows effortlessly, heading towards its destination without asking why or how. John, in his eternal coherence, became that river. His thoughts, his actions, his decisions, all flowed from the center of his being, guided by the beat of his heart. And so, John began to live from a place of deep coherence. It was not a state of perfection, it was not the absence of challenges or trials, but it was a state of true peace. He knew that as long as he remained in tune with his heart, as long as he honored that beat that connected his being with the universe, he would always be in the right place, at the right time, doing what he was meant to do. Life, in its infinite complexity, became simpler in that coherence. John did not need to struggle, he did not need to force things to happen. Everything flowed to him at the perfect moment, and when challenges arose, he faced them from that place of inner calm, knowing that his heart always guided him to the right solution. He had found the secret of inner coherence, and in that secret he had found his true home. Chapter 8: The Collapse of Mental Barriers, the Kaleidoscope of Reality. In the confines of John's mind, the barriers that once seemed impenetrable began to totter, like the walls of an ancient castle besieged by invisible forces. For years, his mind had been the guardian of certainties, the bastion where the world's beliefs and concepts stood as unquestionable banners. But now, those very barriers that had defined his reality were crumbling, slowly but inevitably, under the weight of a new understanding that belonged neither to logic nor to reason. John felt the collapse before he saw it. It was an internal creaking, an erosion of the mental structures that had for so long dictated the contours of his existence. The ideas that once governed his life now seemed fragile, ephemeral, like sandcastles facing the rising tide of a much vaster truth. In their place, a new world began to emerge, one where reality was not limited by the old frontiers of the mind. It was a kaleidoscope of infinite possibilities, an open field where forms dissolved and reassembled with every turn of consciousness. This collapse was disconcerting. John, who had lived so long within the confines of a mind accustomed to the rules of the material world, found himself confronted with a reality that did not respond to the same laws. In the early days there was deep confusion. Old certainties vanished like smoke, and in their place remained a void. But it was not a dark or terrifying void, but a fertile void, a space where the new could sprout freely. One afternoon, as John walked through a forest illuminated by the soft twilight, he felt his perception begin to change. At first it was as if a fine mist covered everything he saw, as if the contours of the world blurred in the air. But he soon realized that it was not the world that was changing, but his way of seeing it. The mind, which had once imposed its own limitations on reality, was now yielding, allowing something deeper to emerge. The trees that once seemed like simple trunks reaching for the sky now vibrated with an inner life that John could feel deep within his being. They were not just objects in space. They were living manifestations of an energy flowing through all things. The ground beneath his feet was no longer just earth, but a vibrant network of connected forces intertwining with his own body and mind. John could feel every step he took resonate in the earth, as if his being were connected to a vast web of life extending beyond his comprehension. And then, in a moment of clarity, John understood what was happening. The mental barriers that had once defined his reality were collapsing, allowing a new way of seeing the world to emerge. He was no longer trapped in the small box of his mind, where everything had to fit into rigid categories. Now he saw the world as a constantly moving kaleidoscope, where forms and patterns dissolved and reassembled with every turn. It was as if the universe itself were a living canvas, and his mind, instead of being a tool of control, had become a window open to infinity. The colors, shapes, and textures of the world were no longer fixed or static. They were fluid, malleable, responding to his inner state with astonishing precision. And John, in that expanded state, began to realize something even deeper. Reality was not something that happened outside of him, but something he himself was creating moment by moment, through the interaction of his consciousness with the world. The mind, which had once been a strict guardian, now unfolded like a vast ocean of possibilities. Every thought that arose had the power to shape reality, to alter the forms and patterns that manifested before him. And in that process, John discovered a new freedom, a freedom that did not come from escaping reality, but from fully immersing himself in it, knowing that everything he saw, everything he experienced, was his creation, a projection of his consciousness onto the vast canvas of the universe. In the days that followed that revelation, John began to explore the depths of this new state of being. He realized that the mind, when free from its old barriers, was able to see beyond appearances, to penetrate the subtler layers of reality. He could see the energy flowing through all things. He could feel the invisible connections that united the physical world with the spiritual world and, above all, he could perceive the underlying unity that connected everything that existed. The collapse of mental barriers was not an easy process. There were moments when John felt he was crumbling, as if his own identity was fading into the void. But instead of resisting that collapse, he learned to surrender to it, to allow the old structures of his mind to dissolve to make way for something much vaster. In that surrender, he found a new strength, a strength that did not come from control or certainty, but from trust in the fluid and changing nature of reality. John began to live his life from this new state of consciousness, knowing that every day, every moment was an opportunity to recreate his reality. He was no longer limited by old beliefs or ancient narratives that had defined his life. Now he could see the world as a constantly changing kaleidoscope, where possibilities were infinite and where he had the power to choose what manifested in his life. And so, John began to experience reality in a completely new way. Every day was an adventure in the vast field of creation, a dance between his consciousness and the world around him. He no longer saw himself as a victim of circumstances, nor as a passive observer of reality. He saw himself as a co-creator, as a being who had the power to shape his world through consciousness, through choice, through the collapse of the old barriers that had once limited him. The kaleidoscope of reality was in constant motion, and John, with a new understanding, embraced that change with gratitude and reverence. He knew that the world was not a fixed place, but a field of infinite possibilities, a canvas on which he could paint with the colors of his soul. And in that process of constant creation, he found true freedom, a freedom that did not come from escaping reality, but from fully embracing it, knowing that at every moment he had the power to collapse old barriers and create something new, something that reflected the true essence of his being. Chapter 9. The Path to the Future. The horizon, tinted with a golden hue that seemed to come from time immemorial, stretched before John like a silent invitation. It was not the same horizon he had gazed upon so many times in his life, nor the same path his feet had trod in days past. This horizon contained the promise of something vaster, something that lay beyond the known limits of mind and body, beyond the shadows that once obscured his vision. It was the threshold of a future not written in the sands of destiny, but woven with the threads of his own will. John breathed deeply, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. He felt his body, renewed and reconfigured by experience, respond with a new vitality, as if every cell were ready to embrace the path stretching before him. But this was not a path marked by visible signs. There were no maps, no compasses, no guides. The future, John understood, was an open space, a canvas that only he could paint with the colors of his choice. For a long time, the future had been a shadow looming over him, a nebula full of uncertainties and doubts. He had tried to foresee it, control it, mold it to his expectations. But now, after the journey that had transformed every aspect of his being, he saw the future in a completely different way. It was no longer a place he had to reach, nor a distant goal he had to conquer. The future was an echo of the present, an extension of his moving self, a dance between what was and what could be. The path to the future was not about escaping the past or rushing forward in search of a new destination. It was about walking with awareness, step by step, moment by moment, knowing that every choice he made in the present created a new path in the vast field of time. John understood that there was no predetermined future, but a future that he himself was forging with every thought, every word, every action. As he walked along that invisible path, he felt the constant presence of the inner wisdom that had awakened in his heart. It was a silent but firm guide, a beacon in the distance that did not impose itself, but gently illuminated the path before him. John did not need to see the entire journey. He knew he only needed to trust that inner light, allowing it to guide him to where his soul needed to go. On his path to the future, John began to perceive something wonderful. The notion of time blurred. The past, which had once been a chain holding him captive to old stories and sufferings, now faded like a shadow losing its shape at dawn. The future, which had been a source of anxiety, now presented itself as an open field of possibilities, ready to be shaped by his deepest intentions. And at the center of all this was the present, that sacred space where everything truly happened. John discovered that the true power of the future lay in his ability to remain rooted in the now. The present was not a place of transit, nor a temporary station on the journey to tomorrow. It was the place where everything came alive, where every choice resonated through the echoes of time, creating ripples that extended into infinity. And by being fully present, John understood that he was creating his future in a more conscious way, more aligned with his true self. The doubts that had once plagued him about what was to come now dissipated in the light of this new understanding. He no longer feared what the future might bring, because he knew that he was his own creator, the architect of his destiny. There was nothing to fear in tomorrow, because tomorrow was merely an extension of today, a manifestation of the seeds he was planting in the present moment. In his walks through the forest, John often found himself thinking about what the future might hold for him. But those thoughts no longer burdened him with anxiety or expectation. Instead, he felt a serenity born from the understanding that the future was not a place he had to reach, but a reflection of his inner evolution. And in that evolution, every step he took brought him closer to his purpose, closer to the truth of who he was and what he had come to be. The future for John was no longer a distant promise or a far-off dream. It was a living current flowing from his own being into the world, permeating everything it touched, transforming reality with the same gentleness with which the wind moves the leaves of trees. John understood that there was no predetermined path, but an infinite series of paths that he himself was tracing as he moved forward. Over time, he began to feel a profound gratitude for everything he had experienced: the dark night of the soul, the dissolution of mental barriers, the awakening of inner coherence. Everything had been part of a process that had prepared him for this moment. The path to the future was not simply a journey into the unknown, but a traverse into a higher version of himself, an expansion of his consciousness into the deepest dimensions of reality. John realized that the true journey was not towards an external destination, but towards the inner realization of his own power as a creator. And that power did not reside in the ability to control external events, but in the ability to be present, to be conscious, to walk with intention in every moment. The future was merely the reflection of that intention, the manifestation of his being in action. Thus, as the sun slowly set on the horizon, John continued his journey into the future, knowing that there was no final destination, but a continuous journey of discovery and creation. Every step he took was a celebration of life, an expression of the gratitude he felt for being alive, for having the opportunity to walk this path. And in that walk, John understood the deepest truth of all: the future was not a place he had to reach. The future was something he was creating in every moment, with every breath, with every beat of his heart. And so, with a free spirit and a peaceful heart, John ventured into the future, knowing that although the path was uncertain, he was always guided by the light that shone within him. The path to the future was, ultimately, the path to himself, to the truth of his eternal being. And on that path, he found true freedom, the freedom to be who he was always meant to be. Chapter 10: The Rebirth of Faith. Connection with the Quantum. The air was charged with a stillness that seemed to hold the mysteries of the universe in its invisible breath. John, who had walked unknown paths on his journey towards self-understanding and the universe, now felt a different call. It was a subtle voice that came not from outside, but from deep within his being, like the echo of a forgotten melody that had always been there, waiting to be heard. That voice invited him to penetrate even deeper, to look beyond the visible layers of reality and enter a realm that transcended time and space, the quantum realm. The word quantum had long been a distant concept for John, a notion that belonged more to the realm of science than to spirituality. But now he faced an unquestionable truth. Science and spirit were two sides of the same coin, two manifestations of the same primordial force that wove the fabric of the universe. And that truth, far from being an incomprehensible mystery, began to unfold before him like a fan of infinite possibilities. It was in the early hours of dawn, when the world slept and silence reigned, that John felt the presence of the quantum most strongly. It was not a presence that could be described in physical terms, nor an energy that could be measured by instruments. It was something much subtler, something that moved in the interstices of being, in the space between thoughts, in the void between breaths. It was a force that enveloped him, but at the same time emanated from deep within his own heart. John began to notice that faith which had been his silent companion in the darkest moments of his journey, was experiencing a rebirth. But this was not the same kind of faith he had known in the past, a faith based on hope or blind belief. This was a quantum faith, a faith that did not depend on what the eyes could see or what the mind could comprehend. It was a faith in the very fabric of reality, in the invisible energy that sustained all things. As he deepened his connection with the quantum, John began to experience something astonishing. Reality, as he had known it, began to reveal itself as a field of possibilities in constant fluctuation. The barriers between the possible and the impossible crumbled before his eyes, and in their place remained an open space where everything was potential, where every instant contained within itself the seed of a new creation. It was as if John had begun to see the world with new eyes, eyes that were not limited by usual sensory perceptions. He could feel the vibration of the particles that made up his environment, as if everything were alive with an energy that pulsed in perfect harmony with the universe. Every object, every person, every experience was nothing more than a temporary manifestation of that infinite quantum field, an ephemeral pattern in the eternal dance of creation. John then understood that quantum faith was not just a matter of believing in something beyond the visible. It was the ability to consciously interact with that field of infinite possibilities. Quantum faith was the faith of the Creator, the faith of one who knows that their consciousness is not a passive observer of reality, but an active participant in its formation. And with that understanding, John felt something within him expand beyond the limits of his body and mind. The faith that was now reborn in him was not a simple acceptance of the unknown. It was an absolute trust in his being's ability to influence quantum reality, to mold the energy field around him. Every thought, every emotion, every intention were waves that resonated in that field, creating energy patterns that eventually manifested in the physical world. John was not just a traveler in time and space. He was a quantum creator, a being capable of influencing the very fabric of existence. Time ceased to be linear for him. It didn't matter if he was in the stillness of night or in the midst of the day's bustle. John felt that his being was connected to a field beyond the clock, beyond the limitations of matter. Everything was happening simultaneously in that vast quantum space, and he could choose, from his awakened consciousness, which of those possibilities would manifest in his life. There was no longer an uncertain future, because John had understood that the future was merely a choice he made in the now. But this rebirth of faith was not just about understanding the functioning of the quantum universe. It was about something much deeper, a connection with the very source of all creation. John began to feel the presence of that source in every aspect of his life, as if a divine energy flowed through him and connected him with all that existed. That energy was not something external to him. It was his own essence, his own soul expanded beyond the confines of the human. In his meditations, John felt his being dissolve into that quantum energy, as if every cell in his body disintegrated into particles of light floating in the infinite ocean of the universe. But it was not a painful dissolution. It was a liberating dissolution, a surrender to the vastness of what he truly was. And in that surrender, John experienced a peace so profound that no words could describe it, a peace that arose from the union with the eternal, with the infinite. As his faith in the quantum deepened, John began to see life from a completely new perspective. Every situation, every encounter, every challenge was no longer something fixed or inevitable. Everything was in motion, everything was in a constant state of flux, and he had the ability to influence that flow with his consciousness. His life was no longer limited by old beliefs about what was possible or impossible. He now lived in a state of constant openness, knowing that at any moment he could shape his reality according to his deepest intentions. And so, John walked through the world with a lightness that had previously been unknown to him. Not because the challenges had disappeared, but because he now understood that those challenges were merely temporary manifestations in the quantum field, reflections of the energies he himself was emitting. And with that understanding, he could choose how to respond to them, how to interact with them, how to transform them. The rebirth of faith in John was not a faith that clung to dogmas or external beliefs. It was a living faith, a faith that arose from his direct connection with the quantum field. It was a faith that empowered him, that reminded him that he was a co-creator with the universe, that every moment contained within itself the power of transformation. And in that faith, John found true freedom, the freedom to be, to love, to live fully in the now, knowing that the universe responded to his consciousness with a precision and grace that could only be described as divine. And so, as the sunlight filtered through the leaves of the trees, John continued his path, knowing that the quantum field was always around him, waiting to be molded by his intention and love. Chapter 11. The Crack Between Time and Space. It was a silent night, where the sky stretched endlessly, studded with stars that seemed to hang like ancient lanterns on a dark velvet tapestry. John, who had traveled many paths on his journey toward understanding himself and the universe, found himself at a crossroads that defied all logic. Reality, as he had known it, began to show its fissures, revealing glimpses of something vaster, something deeper hidden behind the facade of time and space. For days, he had felt the presence of something inexplicable, a vibration in the air, an echo in the confines of his mind that whispered to him from beyond the present. It was not fear that overwhelmed him, but a silent expectation, as if he stood on the verge of a transcendental discovery, a threshold that would lead him to a place beyond the confines of the human. One night, as he sat by a river whose current seemed to sing ancient melodies forgotten by time, something happened. It was a fleeting moment, barely perceptible, but it contained within itself the seed of the infinite. Reality, as he knew it, tore slightly, as if the veil between this world and another had been pierced by an invisible ray of light. John felt the air around him become denser, heavier, and at the same time charged with a vibration that completely enveloped him. It was as if a crack, a tiny but powerful fissure, had opened in the very fabric of time and space. John, with his senses expanded beyond the usual, felt that crack drawing him in, as if inviting him into a parallel reality, a reality where the rules of time and space were nothing more than an illusion, a superficial layer covering something much vaster. Without knowing exactly how, John began to experience the dissolution of time. Seconds, minutes, hours no longer followed their usual course. Everything seemed to happen at once, as if past, present, and future merged into a single point of consciousness. It was a strange sensation, as if he were floating in an ocean where the waves of time vanished before reaching the shore, leaving only an eternal vastness, an infinite field of possibilities. And in that vastness, John realized something astonishing. Time was not linear. It was not an arrow moving in a single direction, as he had always believed. Time was a circle, a spiral, a dance without beginning or end. Every moment, every instant he had lived, was not lost in the past. It continued to exist, vibrating in some dimension that his consciousness was now beginning to touch. And so, as he sat by that river, he could feel the echoes of his life reverberating around him, like shadows dancing to the rhythm of an ancient drum resonating from the depths of the cosmos. John understood that this crack between time and space was not an accident or an isolated phenomenon. It was a door, an opening that allowed him to see beyond the veil of ordinary reality, an invitation to explore the depths of his own existence and of existence itself. This crack was the manifestation of a truth he had begun to glimpse in his connection with the quantum. Time and space were not the only dimensions at play. There were other realities, other worlds, other timelines that intersected at that exact point, waiting to be discovered by those with enough openness to perceive them. As he delved deeper into this experience, John felt his own being begin to dissolve into that vast, interwoven network of time and space. He was no longer confined to a single body, a single identity. He could feel the different versions of himself, the different possibilities of his life, all existing simultaneously in that quantum field of infinite potentialities. Every choice he had made, every path he had not taken, continued to exist somewhere, waiting to be activated by the spark of his consciousness. Space also began to crumble. He was no longer sitting by the river. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. He could feel his being expand beyond the limits of his body, encompassing the landscape around him, merging with the trees, the rocks, the stars. In that expansion, he understood that space was not a distance between things, but a quality of being, a vibration that connected everything that existed in a single network of interconnectedness. And at the center of that network, John found something unexpected, a point of absolute stillness, an immovable center amidst the whirlwind of time and space. This point was not physical. It did not exist in the three-dimensional world he had known. It was the center of his being, the place from which everything emerged and to which everything returned. And at that point, John experienced a peace so profound, so vast, that everything else ceased to matter. There was no more fear, no more doubt, no more confusion. There was only that stillness, that immobility that held him in its silent embrace. The crack between time and space was, ultimately, a crack in his own perception. It was the dissolution of the barriers that had kept him trapped in a limited view of reality. And now, by being completely present in that point of stillness, John could see the truth with a clarity he had never before experienced. Time and space were merely temporary manifestations of a much vaster reality, a reality that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. And in that truth, John found his own essence. He was not just a physical being trapped in the flow of time and space. He was a divine spark, a manifestation of eternal consciousness moving through all dimensions. The crack between time and space was not a rupture, but a revelation, an invitation to remember who he truly was. An infinite being, a quantum being, a being who existed beyond the limits of time and space. As the crack began to close and ordinary reality unfolded before him again, John felt no loss or sadness. He knew he had touched something eternal, something that could not be forgotten or erased. That experience had transformed him forever, and now he walked through the world with a new consciousness, a consciousness that knew that behind every moment, behind every experience, there was an infinite vastness waiting to be explored. John had found the crack between time and space, and by crossing it, he had discovered the true power of his being, a power not subject to the laws of the physical world, but to the laws of eternal consciousness. And with that knowledge, he continued his journey, knowing that although the barriers of time and space seemed solid, there was always a crack, a portal to the infinite, waiting to be discovered by those willing to see beyond the veil of ordinary reality. Chapter 12. The Inner Revolution, the Supernatural Awakening. The air around John vibrated with an unusual energy, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched by invisible forces, preparing for a momentous change. He had come a long way, traversing the shadows of doubt and the desert of the unknown, but now, at this precise moment, something deep and ancient awoke within him. It was an awakening that did not belong to the visible world nor to the material realm. It was an inner revolution, a transformation that resonated in the foundations of his being, shaking the structures that had for so long defined his existence. John could feel it in every fiber of his being. Something was changing. But this change was not something that came from outside. It was not driven by the circumstances of the world or by external forces. It was a rebirth arising from the deepest part of his soul, as if an ancient flame, extinguished by the weight of years and the illusions of the world, was being rekindled by a divine breath. That fire was neither violent nor destructive. It was a sacred fire that purified and transformed, a fire that burned away the impurities of mind and body, preparing the ground for the emergence of something much vaster and more powerful. There was a strange silence in the air, like the prelude to a storm. But it was not a storm of chaos and destruction, but a storm of light, one of transformation that shook everything in its path, destroying old barriers and opening space for the new. John, who had learned to listen to the subtle vibrations of the universe, could feel that revolution within him. He could perceive how the energies flowing through his being began to align in a new harmony, a symphony that did not belong to the world of time, but to the eternal realm of spirit. That inner revolution was not the result of conscious effort or deliberate seeking. It was the fruit of total surrender, of a deep abandonment to the invisible currents that guided his life from the hidden. John had learned throughout his journey that true transformation did not come from resistance or struggle, but from the ability to surrender to the unknown, to trust in the forces operating beyond the rational mind. And now, in that surrender, he was being rewarded with a revelation that transcended anything he had imagined. The supernatural awakening was not an isolated or fleeting experience. It was not a momentary burst of spiritual ecstasy that would fade with time. It was a deep and continuous process, a revolution that shook the very foundations of his existence, transforming every cell in his body, every thought in his mind, every beat of his heart. John could feel his physical, mental, and spiritual self being reconfigured, aligned with a new reality that did not respond to the old laws of the world. Every day, every moment was a new revelation. John felt his body become lighter, more transparent, as if the dense layers of matter that had imprisoned him for so long were disintegrating, freeing him to be more than a simple human being trapped in the limitations of time and space. He could feel energy flowing through his being with a new intensity, an electrical current that connected him not only to the world around him, but to dimensions far beyond the visible. His senses, which had once been limited to what his eyes could see and his ears could hear, now expanded into unknown territories. John could perceive the vibrations of the subtle energies flowing around him. He could feel the movements of the invisible forces that wove the fabric of reality. Every object, every living thing, every particle of air vibrated with a life he had not perceived before. The world, as he knew it, had become much vaster, much more mysterious, and John found himself at the center of that mystery, aware of his role in the great dance of creation. But this awakening was not simply an expansion of his perception. It was, above all, an inner revolution that transformed his very identity. John no longer saw himself as a simple individual separate from the world and other beings. He had begun to experience the profound truth of his unity with all that existed, the understanding that he himself was a manifestation of the same divine power that held the stars in the sky and made rivers flow. The supernatural awakening was, in essence, an awakening to his true nature, a nature that transcended the boundaries of human and divine. Time, which had once been an relentless tyrant, no longer exerted its power over him. John could feel his consciousness expand beyond the limitations of time, touching the eternal dimensions where everything existed in a state of constant flux, where past, present, and future intertwined in a dance of infinite possibilities. In that state of expanded consciousness, John began to understand that the supernatural awakening was not simply a change in perception, but a complete transformation of his being. He was being reconfigured not only physically and mentally, but energetically and spiritually. The old barriers that had kept him trapped in the illusion of separation now crumbled, and in their place arose a new reality, a reality where everything was connected, where every being, every thought, every action was part of a vast tapestry of infinite consciousness. John could feel his own energies align with that tapestry, as his being merged with the totality, becoming a channel for the divine forces flowing through him. In that state of supernatural awakening, John discovered something surprising. The true inner revolution was not an act of struggle or conquest. It was an act of surrender, of total surrender to the forces guiding his life from the invisible. And in that surrender, he found a freedom he had never known before, a freedom that did not come from control or power, but from the deep connection with the very essence of life. John knew that this awakening was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a new phase in his journey. He had been transformed, reconfigured, reborn into a being who was no longer limited by the boundaries of the human. He now walked through the world with a new consciousness, a consciousness that knew that the supernatural was not something separate from the natural, but an extension of it. He had awakened to his true nature, and in that awakening, he had discovered the power that had always resided within him. The power to be, the power to create, the power to live in perfect harmony with the universe. Chapter 13. United in Coherence. The Power of Collective Intention. The light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long, delicate golden rays that seemed to extend beyond the horizon. The air was charged with a sacred stillness, as if the universe itself waited in expectant silence. John, who had walked alone for so long on his journey toward awakening, now felt a different call, a deep whisper inviting him to intertwine with the energies of others, to merge his individual power with that of those who shared a similar vision. Something new was emerging on the horizon of his consciousness, something that transcended his personal experience. The power of collective intention. He had heard before of collective energies, of how groups of people, when aligning their hearts and minds in a common intention, could move mountains, transform realities, and even alter the course of destiny. But those stories had always been distant tales of ancient knowledge that rarely found application in the modern world. However, now, after having experienced an inner revolution that had transformed every part of his being, John understood that true magic lay not in the isolated individual, but in the union of many souls resonating in unison. It was as if a new dimension of reality was unfolding before him, a dimension where the barriers that once separated human beings dissolved in the light of a shared consciousness. John, who had found coherence in his own heart, now felt the call to extend that coherence to others, to intertwine his energy with that of others who, like him, sought a higher, more harmonious reality. It was not just an emotional or mental connection, but a deep vibration, a resonance that arose from the center of his being and extended into the world. One day, while meditating by the edge of a lake, John felt that collective energy like a current gliding gently through the air, as if his every breath was synchronized with the breaths of thousands of other beings, each vibrating at the same frequency, each emanating a common intention. It was a new sensation, yet deeply familiar at the same time, as if it had always been there, waiting to be activated. John understood that coherence was not a state achieved in solitude, but a vibrant field of energy that was amplified when many souls united in the same intention. And that intention was clear: to heal the world, to raise consciousness, to transform reality. John could feel how, by intertwining with that collective energy, his power multiplied, as if every thought, every emotion, every intention emanating from his being was amplified by the force of hundreds of thousands of others who also walked the path of awakening. They were not just isolated individuals, each pursuing their own enlightenment. They were one body, one consciousness, working together to create a new reality. There was immense peace in that connection, a peace that came not from the mind, but from the heart. John understood that collective coherence was not a simple sum of individual energies. It was a synergy that arose when hearts and minds aligned in the same vibration, in the same pulse of love and compassion. It was as if the universe responded to that union, as if the very stars and planets moved in sync with the collective intention, aligning to create a field of infinite possibilities. John, immersed in that energy, began to experience something he had never before felt with such intensity: the palpable force of shared intention. He could feel how, by being aligned with others in that coherence, his deepest thoughts and desires began to manifest with a speed and clarity that defied all logic. It was not just the manifestation of individual desires, it was the manifestation of a collective reality, a reality being co-created by the shared energy of thousands of souls vibrating in unison. The barriers between people that once seemed so solid now dissolved in that light. John could feel the emotions and thoughts of others as if they were his own, not in an intrusive sense, but in a sense of profound compassion and understanding. Every human being who was part of that collective intention was an extension of himself, and he was an extension of them. The pain of one was the pain of all, and the joy of one was the joy of all. In that state of unity, the separation that had characterized the world vanished, leaving only the fundamental truth that everything was interconnected, that everything was one. As the power of collective intention grew, John began to see how the energies around him changed in surprising ways. The air seemed to vibrate with a more intense luminosity, as if the elements themselves were being purified by the group's coherence. Situations in his life that once seemed complicated and without solution began to resolve naturally, effortlessly, as if reality itself was being shaped by the force of that union. John then understood that the true power of collective intention did not lie in brute force or in the manipulation of reality, but in the ability to align with the natural flow of the universe. When many souls united in coherence, that flow became unstoppable, a current of energy that flowed without obstacles, creating new realities, transforming the old into new, the dark into light. There was something deeply sacred in that union, something that transcended any ideology or belief. John realized that collective intention was not just a tool for manifesting desires, it was a door to a higher consciousness, a consciousness that understood that all human beings were intrinsically connected, that the destiny of one was the destiny of all, that the evolution of one was the evolution of all. And in that state of union, John found a new form of power. It was not the power of ego or the power of domination. It was the power of love, the power of compassion, the power of shared intention moving like an irresistible force through the currents of time and space. It was a supernatural power, yet profoundly human at the same time, a power that arose from the simple truth that when hearts and minds aligned in coherence, there was nothing they could not achieve. Thus, John became part of that collective energy, uniting his being with that of others, allowing his energy to merge with the group's energy, knowing that together they were much stronger than they could ever be alone. And in that union, he discovered a peace that went beyond comprehension, a peace that could only be found in the coherence of the collective heart, in the immense and supernatural force of shared intention. Chapter 14. The Dawn of the New Reality. The sky painted itself in golden and purple hues, as if a new day were being colored by the hands of the cosmos itself. The light of dawn, delicate yet full of promises, bathed the earth with a radiance that seemed to announce not just the beginning of another day, but the birth of something much vaster, a new reality. John, standing on a hill overlooking the horizon, could feel that energy in every beat of his heart. The air was imbued with a freshness that spoke to him of renewal, of transformation, of a change that not only affected the outer world but arose from the very depths of being. It had been a long journey. John had walked through paths of darkness and light, crossed the veils of time and space, and now, at the threshold of this new reality, he felt that everything he had experienced had prepared him for this moment. He was not just a spectator in the dawn of this new era. He was an active participant, a creator whose consciousness had been shaped by the mysteries and revelations he had encountered on his path. And now, as the sun slowly ascended on the horizon, John felt the weight and the lightness of his own power, of his ability to shape this new reality unfolding before him. The world John had known, with all its limitations and boundaries, seemed to vanish under the light of this dawn. The old structures that had once governed reality, the concepts and beliefs that had kept humanity trapped in a cycle of repetition, began to dissolve like mist under the warmth of the rising sun. There was something new emerging in the air, something that resonated with a higher, purer frequency, as if the earth itself had awakened to a higher consciousness, inviting all those who could hear its call to join this new dance. John closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the light of dawn to penetrate deeply into his being. He could feel every cell of his body responding to that light, as the energies flowing through him began to vibrate with renewed strength. There was a coherence in that vibration, a harmony that united him not only to the earth beneath his feet, but to the stars that still shone faintly in the morning sky. It was as if the entire universe was in tune with this new beginning, as if every atom was celebrating the birth of this new reality. But this reality was not something that had simply been handed to him. John knew deep in his being that this new reality had been created by the intentions, desires, and aspirations of those who, like him, had walked the path of awakening. It was not a reality imposed from outside, but a reality arising from within, from the heart of every conscious being who had chosen to align with the forces of transformation. And in that understanding, John found a profound peace, knowing that he himself had been a spark in the fire that had given life to this new world. The dawn of the new reality was not simply an external event. It was an inner rebirth, a silent revolution that had begun in the hearts of those who had dared to imagine a different world. John could feel how that revolution had transformed his own being, how the old limitations that had once tied him to a reality of fear and separation had dissolved in the fire of his own awakening. He was no longer the same man who had begun this journey. He was a reborn being, a being who now walked with the certainty that reality was not determined by external forces, but by inner consciousness. And with that certainty, John began to walk down the hillside, descending into the valley that stretched before him. The landscape, though familiar, seemed new under the dawn light. The trees, the mountains, the river winding through the valley, everything vibrated with a clarity and luminosity he had not perceived before. It was as if everything on earth was alive, not just the biological life he had always known, but a spiritual life, an energy that resonated with the same light he had felt in his own being. The world was no longer a separate entity from him. John could feel his energy flowing through everything around him, as every step he took resonated in the earth like a heartbeat in a larger body. And in that resonance, John found a profound connection, a communion with life itself that enveloped and sustained him. He was not alone in this dawn. He was part of a great awakening, a wave of consciousness sweeping the planet, elevating all those who were ready to receive its light. John understood then that the dawn of this new reality was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of something much greater. He had reached a point in his path where the old barriers no longer existed, where the old rules no longer applied. In this new world, consciousness was the true creative force, and those who had awakened to their inner power were the architects of a new era. John did not need to know all the details of what was to come. He only needed to walk with the certainty that every step he took was guided by the light of his own consciousness, by the wisdom he had found in the depths of his being. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John could feel the light's warmth intensify, as if the fire of awakening continued to burn away the last shadows of the old world. But in that fire there was no destruction, only transformation. Everything that had been trapped in the shadows of the past, was now becoming something new, something brighter, fuller, more aligned with the eternal truths that upheld the universe. The dawn of the new reality was not just a physical event, it was a spiritual transformation, a call to all those who were ready to assume their role as co-creators of the world. And John, with his heart full of gratitude and his spirit ignited with the light of awakening, knew he was ready. He had found his way through the darkness, he had crossed the veils of time and space, and now, in this new dawn, he was prepared to walk in the world as a fully conscious being, a being who knew that reality was not something fixed, but something that could be molded by intention, love, and light. And so, as the day continued to unfold before him, John walked toward the new reality with open eyes, a peaceful heart, and a soul ignited with the fire of awakening. The future was no longer a mystery he had to solve, but a canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of his consciousness. And on that canvas, John knew that he, along with all those who had answered the call of awakening, were creating a new world, a world full of light, love, and infinite possibilities. Chapter 15. Awakening Inner Mastery. Techniques to access your quantum power. In the most intimate recesses of human consciousness, there exists a door that few souls have dared to open. That door, sealed by worldly beliefs and the limitations of linear thought, leads to the vastness of the quantum, a space without form or time where all possibilities lie latent. It is not a place accessed by force or mere curiosity. One arrives there through the awakening of inner mastery, a spark that ignites in the heart and expands to touch the edges of the infinite. John, having crossed thresholds that blurred the boundaries of reality, had felt this awakening within his being, a deep vibration that whispered to him about his innate power. He knew that the journey toward mastery of the quantum was not about mastering external forces, but about remembering that those forces had always been an extension of his own essence. Awakening inner mastery was returning to the origin, to that inexhaustible source of power that had never separated from him, but had been hidden under layers of conditioned thoughts, fears, and doubts. To begin this awakening, the first technique John discovered was anchoring in the present. The mind, which so often dispersed between past and future, had to be tamed so that it could hold itself in the now, that eternal space where the quantum resides. John understood that only in the present, where time vanished into the immensity of being, was it possible to access the infinite possibilities waiting to be manifested. He sat in a place where the silence was deep and enveloping, and closed his eyes, allowing his breath to guide him to that point of inner stillness. It wasn't the simple meditation he was used to. This went beyond quieting the mind. It was the creation of a sacred void, a space where quantum energy could be perceived and molded. With each inhalation, John felt his physical body slowly dissolve, as if the boundaries of his skin were diluted by the light emanating from the center of his being. And as he exhaled, that light expanded into the space around him, connecting with the invisible particles that composed the vast quantum field. Once immersed in this space of profound stillness, John practiced quantum visualization, a technique that not only involved imagining a desired outcome, but feeling it in its entirety, imbuing it with the energy emanating from the deepest part of his soul. Visualizing in the quantum field was not a mere mental exercise. It was a sacred communion with the forces that shaped the universe. John knew that for his intention to take shape in physical reality, it had to be permeated with authentic emotions, with a desire born not of ego, but of his purest essence. The challenge was to keep that visualization vivid while allowing quantum laws to do their work, without interference from the rational mind. John learned that the key was not in the intensity of desire, but in the coherence between heart and mind. When both aligned in a unified vibration, quantum power flowed effortlessly, creating and transforming realities in its wake. This state of coherence was not easily achieved. It required practice, patience, and above all, a deep surrender to the natural flow of the universe. As John delved deeper into this practice, he discovered a third technique that elevated his access to the quantum field: the expansion of temporal perception. Time, as he conceived it, was a construct limited by his three-dimensional mind. But by connecting with his inner mastery, he began to perceive time as a malleable fabric, a structure that could be stretched, compressed, or even folded upon itself. In this state of expanded consciousness, John could project himself into possible futures, explore the ramifications of unmade decisions, and even alter the course of past events. It was not simply a mental journey, but a true incursion into the hidden dimensions of quantum reality. When John entered this state of temporal expansion, he could see his life as an infinite web of possibilities, each waiting to be activated by the spark of his conscious intention. And although the concept of altering the past seemed impossible from linear logic, John understood that past, present, and future were merely different aspects of a unified whole. Changing the present from an elevated state of consciousness was enough to reconfigure the energies of the past and open new paths to the future. But this access to quantum power was not a gift reserved for a select few. John knew that any human being could awaken their inner mastery, as long as they were willing to clear the veils that covered their true power. And so, with each passing day, he perfected his techniques, taking his consciousness further and further beyond the confines of physical reality and into the mysterious waters of the quantum. One of the deepest lessons John learned during his journey was the law of quantum detachment. Although he had the power to create and mold reality with his consciousness, he understood that he could not cling to outcomes with an anxious mind. The quantum field responded best when intention was released into the universe, trusting that the energy would move in the right direction. The key was absolute trust in the invisible forces that governed the universe, allowing desires to manifest in ways his limited mind would never have imagined. The process of detachment was not easy for John. It required unwavering faith, a complete surrender to the unknown. But in that surrender, he found a freedom he had never before experienced. Each time he let go of control and allowed the quantum field to do its work, the results that manifested in his life exceeded any expectation he had had. What was once impossible now became real with a fluidity that could only be described as magical. And so, over time, John realized that awakening inner mastery was not simply about accessing a hidden power within him. It was about remembering that this power had always been there, patiently waiting to be activated by his awakened consciousness. True mastery did not consist of controlling the universe, but of aligning with its natural laws, of becoming a pure channel through which quantum forces could flow unobstructed. With each passing day, John continued to refine his connection with the quantum, knowing that his journey had no end. Mastery was not a destination, but a continuous process of expansion and awakening, an eternal dance between the individual self and the infinite universe. And as the sun continued its ascent on the horizon, John knew that although the journey continued, he had already touched the farthest stars of his soul. Chapter 16. The Invisible Limit. Breaking Mental Boundaries Through Coherence. The most impassable frontiers are not made of stone or iron, nor are they erected by human hands. They are invisible limits subtly woven into the mind, built over time by the repetition of thoughts that draw imaginary lines between the possible and the impossible. John had lived most of his life within those frontiers. They were walls without form or physical substance, but they were as solid as any prison built in this world. Still, deep within him, he felt that these frontiers were not natural, that they did not belong to the essence of his being. Something cried out from the depths, a spark that had always known that the limitless was closer than the mind allowed him to believe. The first step in this new chapter of his life was the recognition of these invisible limits. They were the limits that had dictated what he could and could not achieve, the barriers that had restricted his vision, the chains that had tied his potential to a world of predefined forms. He knew he had to break free from these frontiers, but how was unclear. However, John now understood that the answer did not lie in effort or in fighting against these invisible walls. The key to dissolving them resided in coherence, a harmony between his mind, his heart, and his spirit, a deep alignment that had the power to break any mental structure that kept him trapped. Coherence was a word that resonated deep within his being, something that seemed ancient yet new. John understood that coherence was not just an emotional or mental state, but a bridge connecting him to a vaster dimension of reality. When mind and heart were aligned, their energies flowed without resistance, like a river finding its natural course, and in that harmonious flow, the barriers crumbled like light. The process of achieving this coherence was not easy. It required John to first confront the ingrained beliefs that had shaped his perception of the world. These beliefs were like the bricks that had erected the walls of his mind. He had learned in childhood that the world was fixed and that his possibilities were limited by external circumstances. He had believed that success, peace, and happiness were conditions to be achieved through effort, constant struggle, and opportunities offered from outside. But now, in the silence of his new consciousness, John saw clearly that these beliefs were nothing more than veils covering the truth. The journey toward coherence began with the deep listening of the heart. In that inner space where words and thoughts had no place, John discovered an ancient wisdom that had always been waiting to be heard. The heart did not speak in the language of the mind. It needed no logic or justification. Its voice was subtle, like the whisper of a gentle wind through the leaves, but in its simplicity there was an unbreakable truth. Each time John allowed himself to immerse in that space of stillness, he felt his mind, once so rigid and structured, begin to soften, to become more fluid, more receptive to new possibilities. One of the most powerful practices John discovered was coherent breathing. By consciously breathing from the heart, he not only calmed his mind but began to synchronize the frequencies of his body and soul, creating a state of inner unity. John found that when his breathing became slow and rhythmic, his thoughts also began to slow down, allowing him to enter a state of deep peace and connection. It was as if each inhalation opened a door to a broader dimension of reality, a reality where the limitations of his mind no longer held power. In that state of coherence, mental frontiers began to fade. John realized that these barriers were nothing more than constructs of his own perception, illusions created by a mind that had forgotten its true nature. And now, by being aligned with the energy of his heart, he could see beyond those illusions. Possibilities that once seemed impossible now presented themselves as open paths, ready to be explored. Coherence was the key that opened the doors to the unknown. But breaking mental boundaries did not simply mean getting rid of old beliefs. It also meant expanding consciousness into territories that were once beyond his reach. John began to experiment with his ability for expanded visualization, a process in which he no longer just saw images in his mind, but felt them as if they were real, tangible, present in his being. In this state of coherence, imagination and reality began to intertwine, and John could feel every image he visualized come alive within him, projecting itself into the universe. The mind, which had once been a prison, now became a vast playground, a space where the laws of physics and time could be manipulated at will. John realized that the limitations he had experienced in the past were merely manifestations of the mental boundaries he himself had accepted. But now, being in coherence, he could break those boundaries and explore realities that once seemed inaccessible. However, John also understood that true coherence not only involved the collapse of inner barriers but also harmonization with the outer world. Coherence was not just about his personal well-being but about his ability to resonate with the energies around him, to align with the invisible forces that wove reality. When he was in coherence, he not only broke his own limitations but also aligned with the natural flow of the universe, becoming a channel for conscious creation. The path to coherence was a journey that never ended. Every day, every moment offered new opportunities to deepen in that state of alignment, to release new layers of limiting beliefs and thoughts, to open new doors to higher realities. John knew that although he had already broken many mental barriers, much remained to be explored, many more invisible limits that had to be dissolved in the light of coherence. And so, as the sun rose above the horizon, illuminating the world with its golden light, John continued his journey, knowing that true power did not reside in the mind alone, but in the union of mind and heart, in the coherence that broke barriers and opened the way to the limitless. The invisible limit had begun to fade, and John, with every step he took, delved deeper and deeper into a world where boundaries no longer existed, where mind and heart danced together in perfect harmony, creating a reality that was beyond any known limit. Chapter 17. The Secret Power of Vibration. Tuning into the frequency of manifestation. The entire universe vibrates in a silent symphony, a melody that weaves the fabric of reality. John had begun to perceive that music in the deepest corners of his being, an underlying pulse that resonated in everything he touched. But he still didn't fully comprehend the secret power of that vibration, nor how his own energy was another string in that cosmic harp, capable of attracting, repelling, and transforming everything around him. He knew that manifestation wasn't just a matter of intention or desire. It was a matter of vibration, and only by tuning into the correct frequencies could he activate that hidden power waiting to be awakened. To understand the power of vibration, John had to delve into the universe's most ancient secrets, those hidden whispers known only to the wise. He discovered that everything that exists, whether visible or invisible, physical or ethereal, has a specific vibrational frequency. Thoughts, emotions, words, even objects, all vibrated at different tunes. And the secret to manifesting what he desired lay not merely in asking or imagining, but in adjusting his own vibration to match the frequency of what he wanted to bring into his life. This knowledge was profound and ancient. John understood that the law of vibration did not operate superficially. It was the very foundation upon which all creation was built. Like a stone falling into a pond, every vibration emanating from his being created ripples in the quantum field around him, ripples that extended beyond the visible, beyond the known, shaping reality as they moved. The power of vibration was invisible yet constant, and its ability to mold John's life depended on his skill in tuning into the right frequencies. The first step on this journey was conscious self-observation. John realized he couldn't change what he didn't know. So, he began to observe himself at every moment, every thought, every emotion, every word. What frequency did he emit when he thought of his desires? What was the dominant vibration in his being when facing challenges? The key to manifesting lay not simply in having positive thoughts, but in vibrating at a frequency of inner harmony, in alignment with the natural flow of the universe. Once John became aware of his vibrations, he understood that each emotion had a tone, an energetic texture that affected his vibrational field. Sadness, fear, and doubt were low, dense frequencies that slowed down the manifestation process, like fog obscuring the path to his dreams. On the other hand, love, gratitude, and inner peace vibrated at high frequencies, frequencies that resonated with the creative forces of the universe, accelerating the arrival of his desires. John began practicing emotional attunement. Each morning, he knew the day would bring challenges and fluctuations, but he decided that regardless of external circumstances, he could choose the frequency he wanted to vibrate at. He would close his eyes upon waking, and in the stillness of dawn, he allowed his heart to set the tone of his vibration. He recalled moments of deep gratitude, pure love, unbreakable peace, and let those emotions expand throughout his being. In that elevated state, he felt his energy become luminous, light, resonating with the secret melody of the universe. Vibration, however, was not something he could force or artificially fabricate. John learned that authenticity was essential. He couldn't simply think positive emotions while his inner being vibrated in the dissonance of fear or despair. So, instead of fighting dense emotions, he observed them with compassion, allowing them to exist but choosing not to get trapped in them. Emotions were like ocean waves, always changing, but the true vibration of his being came from a deeper, more constant place. Over time, John discovered an even more powerful truth. He could not only influence his own vibration, but he could also tune into the vibrations of the universe itself. In his meditations, he began to feel the subtle currents flowing through the cosmos, those invisible waves carrying the energy of creation. When he tuned into these currents, his own vibrational field naturally elevated, like a leaf gently floating on a clear stream. It was no longer about forcing manifestation, but about allowing his vibration to align with the natural flow of creation. The secret power of vibration, then, was not just a matter of internal adjustment. It was a dance with the universe, a constant interaction between his vibration and the frequencies around him. John learned to listen for the subtle signals the universe sent him, small coincidences, intuitions, and sensations that guided him to the right frequency. When he was in coherence with the universe, everything flowed effortlessly. Opportunities, people, ideas, everything arrived at the perfect moment, as if orchestrated by a higher intelligence. John also began to notice that collective vibration had an impact on his own frequency. By surrounding himself with people whose energies were aligned with love, abundance, and creativity, his own vibration naturally elevated. The power of vibration was not something to be explored in isolation. John understood that it could be amplified in community, when multiple souls vibrated in unison, creating an energetic field so powerful that their desires began to manifest with astonishing speed. However, the process was not entirely straightforward. There were days when John's vibration plummeted under the influence of old fears and limiting beliefs. But even in those moments, he learned to accept the natural oscillation of his energies, knowing that vibration was not static. Instead of fighting against those moments of low frequency, he embraced them with patience, allowing the energy to gradually transform. It was in those moments of acceptance that his vibration began to rise again, not through effort, but through simple surrender to what is. With each step on his journey toward vibrational mastery, John realized that the secret power of vibration was not an external power to him, but a force that had been latent within his being all along. Tuning into the frequency of manifestation was not about learning something new, but about remembering how to vibrate in harmony with the universe. The power was already there, waiting to be awakened, waiting to be activated by the awakened consciousness of whoever was ready to hear its call. And so, John continued walking, resonating ever more deeply with the vibrations of love, gratitude, and creation. He knew that as long as his vibration remained aligned with the highest frequencies of the universe, everything he desired would be not only possible, but inevitable. The laws of vibration were constant and faithful, and John, with his heart in coherence and his soul vibrating in harmony, became a master of manifestation, dancing with the universe in a constant flow of creation. Chapter 18. The Alchemy of the Mind. Transmuting your thoughts into tangible realities. In the most ancient corners of human history, alchemists sought the philosopher's stone, that mythical substance capable of turning lead into gold, of transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. But what many didn't understand was that the true alchemical power resided not in the mastery of external elements, but in the mastery of the mind itself. Alchemy, in its purest form, is the art of transmuting thoughts, of converting ethereal ideas into tangible realities, of forging worlds from the invisible matter of spirit. John had begun to glimpse this secret during his inner journey, when the boundaries of logical thought began to dissolve before the vastness of his consciousness. He understood that thoughts, though invisible, were substance, and that within them resided the power of creation itself. But it wasn't enough to simply think. There was an art, a science behind the transmutation of thoughts. It was a subtle alchemy that demanded not only intention, but precision and purity of focus. The first principle John discovered on his alchemical journey was that of mental purification. Just as ancient alchemists purified elements in their laboratories, John understood that he had to purify his thoughts before attempting to turn them into realities. The mind, like a cauldron of thoughts and emotions, was full of residues, fears, doubts, limiting beliefs, that contaminated the creation process. Every time he tried to manifest something from an impure mental state, what emerged in his reality was distorted, incomplete, or simply failed to materialize. To purify his mind, John practiced a form of conscious letting go. He would sit in silence, allowing his thoughts to emerge without judgment or attachment, like clouds floating in a vast sky. Each thought that arose was observed, examined for its nature, and then released, like a whisper in the wind. In doing so, John realized how often his thoughts were contaminated by societal expectations, inherited fears, or superficial desires. By letting them go, he began to feel his mind become clearer, purer, like a crucible prepared to receive the highest elements of spirit. Once his mind was clear, John moved to the next phase of mental alchemy, the fixation of thought. Here, the desired thought had to be nurtured and held in the mind with constant intensity, like the fire burning in an alchemist's forge. But this was not a process of mere positive thinking. John learned that true thought fixation required a deep fusion with emotion. It wasn't enough to imagine the desired outcome. He had to feel it as if it were already real. Emotion, in its purest state, was the catalyst that ignited the fire of transmutation. John would begin his mornings by visualizing what he wished to manifest, but not in a vague or superficial way. Every detail had to be felt with an almost tangible precision. If he desired peace, he felt the softness of that peace flowing through his body. If he desired abundance, he could feel the fullness, the expansion that abundance brought with it. And above all, he maintained that feeling throughout the day, as if his mind was constantly immersed in the alchemical cauldron, transforming those emotions into creative energy. But the alchemy of the mind was not limited to visualization or desire. There was another key element John discovered on his journey, the principle of inverse transmutation. In traditional alchemy, elements were elevated from their crude state to a purer one. But in the alchemy of the mind, the process was inverse. Ideas existing in the subtle realm of spirit had to descend into matter, to be brought from the ethereal to the physical world. This process required an anchoring, a conscious connection with material reality that allowed divine ideas to take tangible form. To prepare his being before crossing the portal, John practiced what he called the void meditation. In this meditation, he did not seek to visualize or manifest anything in particular. His goal was to empty himself of everything, to become an open space, a vessel that the universe could fill with its infinite energy. Sitting in silence, John allowed himself to dissolve his thoughts one by one, until only silence remained, a silence so vast and profound that it seemed to extend to the ends of the cosmos. In that state, he felt as if his being expanded beyond his body, beyond time, connecting with all things, with all possible futures, with all realities. Once he had reached this state of void, John knew he was ready to activate conscious quantum creation. This activation did not involve a forced act of will, but a deep alignment with the quantum field. John visualized the portal before him, not as a physical door, but as a vibration, a frequency to which he had to attune himself. He felt his energy begin to resonate with that frequency, as if his entire being were synchronizing with the quantum flow around him. In that state, there was no separation between him and the universe. They were one thing, one energy in constant motion. The step towards conscious quantum creation was taken from this state of unity. John understood that in this place of the infinite, it was not about asking, forcing, or desiring. It was about allowing the universe to act through him. His intention, as clear and pure as crystal, became a spark that ignited quantum possibilities, drawing to himself those that resonated with his being. It was not a creation from the mind. It was a creation from the heart, from the soul, where all things existed in their potential form before taking shape in physical reality. But what made this process truly powerful was the unwavering certainty with which John maintained his connection to the quantum field. He knew, without the slightest doubt, that what manifested in that state of unity was already created, even before it took visible form. Conscious quantum creation was not a linear process. It was a simultaneous unfolding where time and space intertwined in an eternal dance, allowing the desire to already exist on some level of reality. John, by being attuned to that reality, could see it, feel it, and finally bring it into the physical world. Crossing the portal, John discovered that the power of conscious quantum creation was not just a personal power, but a sacred responsibility. Every thought, every intention arising from that state of consciousness had the potential to transform not only his own life but the entire fabric of reality around him. Every act of conscious creation affected everything it touched, like a stone dropping into a lake and creating ripples that extend to the farthest shores. John understood that quantum creation could not be taken lightly. It was a dance with cosmic forces that required deep integrity and alignment. As he advanced into this new territory of creation, John also understood that the portal of the infinite was not a place to be reached only once, but a state that had to be cultivated continuously. It was a constant flow, a perpetual invitation to co-create with the universe in every moment of his life. There was no longer a before and after, a moment of creation and another of waiting. Everything was creation, everything was manifestation. Every breath was an opportunity to shape reality from the depths of his consciousness. The portal of the infinite, though vast and unfathomable, became John's home, a space where reality was no longer something fixed, but something malleable, something that responded to every pulse of his being. Here, in this state of conscious quantum creation, John finally understood that there were no limits to what he could manifest. Everything that existed in his mind, everything his heart yearned for, was already present in some form in the quantum field. All he had to do was cross the portal again and again, with each new desire, with each new intention, knowing that the universe responded to every vibration with perfect precision. As the sun ascended over the horizon, bathing the earth in a golden light that seemed to radiate from the very heart of the cosmos, John knew that his journey had no end. The portal of the infinite would always be open for those who had the courage to cross it, for those who dared to leave behind the limitations of the ego and embrace the vastness of the quantum. And so, John walked with firm steps towards that vast ocean of possibilities, knowing that in every moment, in every breath, he had the power to create, to transform, to shape a universe that always responded to the call of his awakened soul. Epilogue: The Mastery of Quantum Creation. The teachings presented in this book are not mere words on a page, nor simple theories to be contemplated at a distance. They are open doors to a vast inner realm, a space in which every human being has the power to become the conscious creator of their reality. But as with any true knowledge, the key lies not only in understanding it, but in living it. The alchemy of the mind, the power of vibration, the coherence between heart and mind. Everything revealed here is an invitation to practice, to explore, and to awaken consciousness to a deeper level. Throughout these pages, we have walked a path that has led us to touch the infinite, to cross invisible thresholds that separate the ordinary from the extraordinary. We have spoken of the latent power that lies within each of us and how that power, when aligned with the forces of the universe, can manifest realities that once seemed unattainable. However, the journey does not end with the last page of this book. In truth, this is where it begins. The power of conscious quantum creation is not something reserved for a select few, nor is it a gift bestowed only upon those who seek in the highest mountains or in the depths of esoteric mysteries. This power is available to all who are willing to look within, to clear the veils of illusion, and to remember the truth of their being. But for this power to be real in your life, it must be cultivated day by day. It is not enough to know the theory. You must practice the inner alchemy of transforming thoughts, emotions, and energies into tangible realities. Applying these teachings requires discipline, but not a rigid or forced discipline. It is a discipline that arises from the deep desire to experience the truth of your own creative power. Every moment of life becomes an opportunity to practice. How are you vibrating at this instant? How are your thoughts and emotions aligned with the realities you wish to create? Every day, every situation is an alchemical laboratory in which you can test, adjust, and perfect your ability to manifest. The first step towards applying these teachings is inner coherence. Before attempting to change the outer world, you must align your inner world. Are your mind and heart in sync? Is there peace within your being, even amidst chaos? Coherence does not mean the absence of challenges, but the ability to maintain calm and focus even when circumstances seem unfavorable. When you cultivate this inner coherence, your energy field expands and begins to resonate with the higher frequencies of the universe. From that state of coherence, the desires of the heart can manifest more quickly and precisely. Vibration is another fundamental principle that must be continuously explored. Every thought you think, every emotion you feel, emits a vibration that sends signals to the quantum field. By consciously tuning into the highest vibrations, love, gratitude, peace, compassion, you begin to attract experiences, people, and opportunities that resonate with those same frequencies. Manifestation is not simply about forcing results, but about vibrating so coherently with what you desire that the universe cannot help but align with you. On this journey, you will also learn the importance of detachment. Quantum creation cannot flourish in a state of rigid control. You must be able to plant the seed of your intention in the quantum field and then allow the universe to do its work. This does not mean passivity, but a deep trust that once you have sent your intention into the universe, the invisible forces will begin to move to manifest what you have desired. Detachment is not a lack of interest, but an active faith in the creative process. Finally, the greatest challenge and reward of this entire journey is self-mastery. Becoming a conscious quantum creator means you can no longer blame the outside world for your experiences. You are the architect of your reality, the alchemist who transforms circumstances through mind, heart, and spirit. This can be a burden for some, but for those willing to take full responsibility for their lives, it is the greatest freedom. You know that everything you experience has been shaped in some way by yourself, and if there's something you don't like, you have the power to change it. The portal of the infinite is always open for those who have the courage to cross it, for those who are willing to abandon the certainties of the ego and surrender to the vast immensity of the quantum. Conscious creation is not a gift received once, but a skill perfected over time, with practice, with dedication. By applying these teachings in your daily life, you become the master of your own destiny, the alchemist who transforms the invisible into visible, the possible into reality. The universe, in all its immensity, is always listening, always responding to the vibrations you emit. Your life, at every moment, is the reflection of the energies you have sown in the quantum field. So, as you close this book and continue your journey through the world, remember that the power is in your hands. Every thought, every emotion, every action is a spark that ignites the flame of creation. And you, as a conscious alchemist, have the power to mold the universe to your will, crossing again and again the portal of the infinite, creating a reality that resonates with the deepest truth of your being. May this book be not just an end, but a new beginning. May these teachings accompany you not as distant ideas, but as living tools that you use every day to shape a life of conscious creation, manifestation, and mastery. The journey continues, always forward, always towards the infinite. Acknowledgements. To you, unknown author, whose words have no face, but whose wisdom transcends time and space. This journey into conscious quantum creation, into the awakening of the latent power within each of us, would not have been possible without the echo of your silent voice that, though invisible, resonates in the depths of every soul that seeks. I give thanks for the silent impulse that inspires us all to look beyond the obvious, to find in the shadows the seeds of potential, to rise above the limitations we ourselves have built. Without your immaterial presence, this book would not have found its course, nor would it have been able to awaken in us the memory of the vastness that dwells within our being. You are the spark in the heart of every seeker, the invisible hand that guides, and the wind that whispers ancient truths. Therefore, though I cannot see or name you, I thank you deeply for having walked beside me on this journey into the unknown, into the infinite.